I thought I knew what petty looked like, until my own neighborhood proved me wrong. Imagine walking outside only to find a bright orange notice slapped on your front door, threatening fines for something as simple as where you parked your own truck. At first, I laughed it off, but then the letters turned into warnings and the warnings into threats. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power, and the person pulling the strings wasn't going to stop until I broke. But here's the thing. They had no idea who they were messing with. So, how far would you go to fight back? When my family first moved into the neighborhood, we thought we had finally found peace. The streets were lined with tall oaks, the houses were neatly kept, and the community felt safe enough that kids could ride their bikes until the sun went down. For us, it wasn't just a house. It was the dream we had worked years to afford. We loved barbecues in the backyard, waving to neighbors on morning walks and watching our kids play without a care in the world. Of course, like every neighborhood, there were rules. The HOA had its handbook full of guidelines about lawns, paint colors, and parking. At first, it all seemed harmless, just a way to keep things looking tidy. I didn't think much of it. After all, who argues over mailbox height or the shade of green on your shutters? But beneath that polished surface, there was something brewing. A small group of people in charge seemed to take the rules far more seriously than anyone else. And little by little, their focus shifted. What started as friendly reminders soon began to feel more like warnings. Looking back now, I realized the first signs were already there. The questions, the stares, the little notes slipped under my door. I just didn't know that our dream neighborhood was about to turn into a battlefield. At first, it was just a letter. A thin white envelope tucked into the edge of my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a courtesy notice, politely reminding me that my truck was not permitted to be parked in my own driveway overnight. According to the rules, all non-standard vehicles had to be stored out of sight. Now this was no rusted junker. It was my pride and joy, a spotless, fully paid-off pickup that I used for work every single day. I thought, fine, maybe it's just a mistake. But it wasn't. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this one far less friendly. It warned of fines if the truck wasn't moved. At this point, I called the HOA office, hoping to clear things up. The woman on the phone sounded rehearsed, like she'd said the same line 100 times that week. All vehicles must comply with community standards. When I asked who decided what standards meant, she simply repeated the rule and hung up. That's when I started noticing them. The stares, neighbors slowing their cars as they passed my house, people whispering when I walked to the mailbox. And then, one morning, I found an anonymous note taped to my door. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear. Rules are rules. Get that eyesore out of here. My stomach turned. This wasn't about a truck anymore. It was about control. The fines started piling up. $50 for the first week, then $100. Each notice came with bold red letters. Failure to comply may result in legal action. I tried to fight back. I sent emails and letters, and even showed up at the monthly HOA meeting to plead my case. But every time I spoke, the board president, a sharp-tongued woman with a permanent scowl, cut me off. Her favorite line was, "If we make an exception for you, we'll have to make an exception for everyone." Except that wasn't true, because a quick walk around the neighborhood revealed plenty of non-standard vehicles sitting in driveways. SUVs, vans, even a camper trailer down the street. None of them had letters taped to their doors. None of them were being fined. It was only me. I asked myself why. Why was I the target? And then it hit me. A week before that first letter arrived, I had refused to sign a voluntary petition the board was pushing. They wanted to increase HOA fees to fund a fancy new clubhouse. I said no, not because I didn't care about the community, but because I knew it was unnecessary. My no vote wasn't personal, but to them, it was an insult. And suddenly, everything started making sense. That's when the harassment escalated. One evening, I came home to find a bright orange sticker slapped on my windshield. "This vehicle is subject to towing." The next morning, a tow truck actually idled across the street, its engine rumbling like a threat. I rushed out, demanding to know who had called them. The driver just shrugged, saying he was waiting for authorization. Authorization from whom? I didn't have to ask. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me jump, certain they were coming from my truck. I started parking it in the garage, crammed so tightly that I had to squeeze out through the passenger side. But even then, the letters didn't stop. Now they were accusing me of garage misuse, because all homeowners must maintain space for two vehicles. It was absurd. I had two cars, and both fit. But they didn't care. They just kept moving the goalposts. Each time I thought I'd caught up, they found another way to corner me. The night it all came to a head started like any other. I had just pulled into my driveway after a long day, only to find yet another violation notice taped across my front door in thick, bold letters. Final warning. My hands shook as I tore it down. The letter claimed that my repeated disregard for community standards had forced the board to take emergency enforcement measures. And then came the line that made my blood run cold. Your vehicle will be removed at the homeowner's expense. This was it. The moment they'd been threatening for months. The HOA was actually moving to tow my truck. I barely slept that night, waiting, listening, heart pounding at every distant engine sound. By morning, I knew what I had to do. If they wanted a showdown, then a showdown was exactly what they were going to get. Just before noon, I heard it. The low growl of a diesel engine rumbling down the street. I stepped outside, and there it was, a tow truck crawling toward my driveway, beacon lights flashing like a warning siren. Behind it trailed a handful of curious neighbors, some watching with pity, others with barely disguised satisfaction. And standing at the curb, arms crossed and smirking like she'd already won, was the HOA president herself. Her voice rang out sharp and cold. "This is what happens when you refuse to follow the rules. Consider this a lesson to the rest of the neighborhood." My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep calm. I walked straight to the truck and looked the driver dead in the eye. He glanced nervously at the paperwork in his hands, then at me. He was expecting a fight, maybe even begging, but he wasn't expecting what I said next. "Don't hook it up," I told him. "You're on my clock." The look on his face was priceless, a mix of confusion and dread. Because you see, that tow truck didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. The very company they had called to humiliate me was the company I had built from the ground up. That driver was my employee. That truck was my asset. And in that moment, the power shifted. The days after the showdown were unlike anything I had ever experienced in that neighborhood. For months, I have felt like the outcast, the problem homeowner, who couldn't just play along. But now, the energy had shifted. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact were suddenly stopping me on the sidewalk, some offering apologies, others sharing their own horror stories about the HOA's harassment. One elderly couple admitted they had been fined over the color of their shutters, a shade of blue the board president personally didn't like. Another neighbor confessed she'd been forced to resod her entire front yard twice because the grass wasn't green enough. And then there was the single mom down the street who had been threatened with liens over her teenage son's basketball hoop in the driveway. It was like a dam had broken. For the first time, people realized they weren't alone. The fear that had kept everyone silent was gone, replaced with anger and, more importantly, unity. And at the center of it all was the HOA president, the once untouchable figure who had ruled the board with an iron fist. After the towing fiasco, her credibility evaporated overnight. The very next week, the HOA held its monthly meeting. Usually, these gatherings were dull affairs with a handful of attendees, but this time, the community center was packed wall to wall. People stood in the back, arms crossed, waiting. For the first time, the board looked nervous. When the president called the meeting to order, she tried to brush past the incident as if it had been a minor misunderstanding. But the crowd wasn't having it. Voices rang out, demanding answers. Why were rules enforced selectively? Why were fines used like weapons instead of guidelines? Why did one person's opinion carry more weight than the entire community's? She stammered, deflected, and tried to regain her usual control. But the tide had turned too far. And when a motion was raised for a vote of no confidence, nearly every hand in the room went up. By the end of that night, the president, the same woman who had threatened to take my house, was forced to resign in humiliation.